If everything in the world communicates something that is untrue to you, how in the world are you to believe something different? I came across this concept as a student at Africa University in Zimbabwe in 2000. The philosophy of Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness movement basically says if the whole world communicates to you that you're inferior, you have inferior schools, your parents have inferior incomes, you have inferior modes of transportation, inferior housing, inferior crime rates. If your whole world communicates to you that you are inferior, how in the world are you to look at the world in the eye and say to the world, you are a liar? The Black Consciousness movement says it's impossible without a transformation of consciousness. Biko says the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Now, we are living in a world that many call a post-truth world. A world where we are constantly bombarded by marketing, propaganda, demagoguery, and spin that communicates untruth to us. The most potent weapon in the marketers and the demagogues and the spin doctors are our minds. And if everything in the world is telling us things that are untrue, how in the world are we supposed to believe anything different? The writer of Hebrews says, faith is the evidence of things unseen. I like this tapestry over here because the Black Consciousness movement and Steve Biko helped me to realize that the unique thread of the church in the fabric of society is to share and develop the faith in Jesus Christ that debunks the lies of the world and helps us to have a transformed consciousness, to see ourselves as we really are, to see others as they really are, and to see God as God really is. I also became horrified at how I had been doing ministry in a large, wealthy megachurch in Dallas, Texas. Now, data shows that the church tends to offer little to no faith services to the beneficiaries or recipients of her social services. And I was the director of missions and outreach at a very large, wealthy church. And I became horrified at how many of the ministries not only did little to share our faith, our greatest gift, but many of our ministries reiterated the lies of the world by setting up a paradigm of the privileged haves and the underprivileged have-nots. I ran a program every Christmas where I would match up wealthy, predominantly white families to adopt underprivileged, low-income Latinx families in West Dallas in our Adopt a Family program. Now, I challenge anyone in this room to find a word in the English language that is more paternalistic than the word adopt. I returned home to Dallas from Zimbabwe and was immediately approached by Sarah Wilkie and the Bishop of the North Texas Conference, and I was asked to plant a Spanish language church in the North Love Field, Northwest Dallas community. Now, if you search the worst neighborhoods in Dallas, the Northwest neighborhood is consistently ranked number 1 or 2 as the worst neighborhoods in Dallas. Well, in 2002, I moved into this community. I began knocking doors, began meeting people. I gathered with a small group in my living room. Then we worshiped in a storage room of an apartment complex. And by the time I left in 2017, it had grown to be the largest Spanish language church in the United Methodist denomination. And we had the social programs that you would expect from such a community. You know, we had after-school programs, summer programs, education programs. We had advocacy for immigrants. We also had immigration clinics, etc. But one thing that I vowed I wouldn't do when I started is get in the business of doing distribution ministries, because I did not like how such distribution ministries would set up the haves and distributing to the have-nots like we were on a Mardi Gras float. But Adriana changed that. Adriana was a mother of 4, an unauthorized immigrant. She cleaned houses for a living. And in 2004, she and her 14-year-old son both had cancer. She began going to a church in downtown Dallas, First United Methodist, and getting food assistance for her family. Fast forward a couple of years, she's well, her son is well, and her caseworker says, "Why don't you distribute some of this food at your church?" And so Adriana comes to her pastor and says, "Pastor, I think we need to distribute some food here too." And I said to Adriana, I said, "Well, if you want to distribute food here, I will support you distributing food if that's what you feel like God is calling you to do." And so she did. So the next month, she got some extra food and threw it in the back of her pickup truck. She came out to La Fundación de Cristo and distributed it in the community. Then she later recruited a guy who had a tree trimming service in our congregation, got him to use his truck, his trailer, and his team to go downtown, load it up with food, come out to La Fundación de Cristo, and to distribute it. And she timed it where we would have it the second week of the month, because she said people got paid on the first of the month. After they had paid their rent, it was that second week that was the hardest before the check on the 15th came in. This ministry that could have patterned itself after the lies of the world became a transforming ministry as Adriana saw herself as she really was. As it transformed how Adriana's kids saw her. Her daughter Tita now runs a ministry that's held in multiple churches in Dallas for special needs children. And when I ask her about it, she says, "It's because I grew up watching my mother help people, and I wanted to help people." And it transformed the way our community saw itself. Now, anytime the distribution was going on, I tried to make sure I was nowhere present or visible, because my job was to minister to Adriana, to support Adriana. And like many of our pastors, my job was also to raise money so we could do this ministry. I once had this church from the suburbs of Corinth contact me. And they wanted to donate some soccer equipment for our soccer ministry. And they wanted nobly to have some interaction with our congregation. And so they pitched, "Why don't we just bring this equipment down? We'll run a clinic for your kids. And then when we leave, we'll just leave all the equipment there." And I was just thinking to myself, I hate this idea. I hate the optics of what it has, and I'm also thinking to myself, I was like, so we're going to have these, privileged white persons come down, and they're going to come and run a soccer clinic for families that are have many more years entrenched in soccer than these families. And so I pitched to the pastor. I said, how about y'all bring the equipment down early when no one's around, and then our youth soccer team runs a clinic for your kids. The pastor said, this is a great idea. It comes together great. Coach Alejandra sets them up, runs some drills. Her son, Alex, translates for her. Then we set up a scrimmage where we mix in our youth and their kids together. And I remember there was this shaggy-haired redhead kid from Corinth, and he got teamed up with our best player, Jose. Now, Jose was just phenomenal. He was this youth. He kind of looked tough. He had the lines cut in his hair, but he was an artist with the soccer ball. And as they were playing, Coach Alejandra yelled to her son, Alex, and to Jose, Alex, Jose, deje que el niño meta un gol. Let this kid score. So Jose would do his artistry coming down the field, and then right as he would get to the goal, he would bunt it over to the shaggy redhead kid, who would then kick it at the goal, and Alex would completely feign going for the ball, and boom, the kid would score goal after goal, and after each goal, he would run down the field as if he was Messi and say, and he went up to his pastor and says, Pastor, this is the best day of my life. And I'm thinking, of course it is, kid, you can't miss. You know, I grew up in a small rural town in East Texas, and I had some very unhelpful prejudices and stereotypes that I'm still in recovery for, that got ingrained in me. I like to think that this shaggy redhead kid and his parents, when they see youth that look like Jose or Alex, or see mothers on a caravan on the news that look like Alejandra, that perhaps their first thought is, I bet they're nice, and I bet they play soccer. And on the other side of that, when I think about Jose, Alejandra, and Alex, our world does a really effective job at telling them that they are less than those families who are much more privileged in many ways. Maya Angelou says, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you do, but people won't forget how you made them feel. Well, that day on the soccer pitch, we turned the world's order on its head. And that is what we tried to do in all of the ministries of Christ Foundry or La Fundación de Cristo. To expose the lies of the world and to share the good news of the gospel that help people see themselves and see others and see God as we really are. And this is not something new. It was just something I had to rediscover. Because there was a group of Christians living in the first century in the center of spin, demagoguery, and oppression in the Roman Empire. And the Apostle Paul wrote them a letter and shared these words to them. Let us not be conformed to the lies of the world, but let us be about the business of transforming consciousness. Now, I'd like to think that my experience with Biko was more like a Damascus Road experience, but really, I'm much more like Peter. Every time I think I got it, every time Peter seemed to have gotten, he would demonstrate that he didn't quite get it. And that's been my journey. When I started knocking doors at Christ Foundry, I would ask people, what do you need? Because I was trained. First, you try to meet people's felt needs. But it wasn't until I humbled myself and changed my question to, will you help me? That our ministries really began to blossom. And that consciousness began to be transformed. And that God used people like Alejandra, Adriana, Alex, and Jose to transform my conscience. Because you don't have to be a low-income, unauthorized immigrant living in Northwest Dallas to need a transformed consciousness. We're living in what many call a post-truth world, where we are constantly bombarded with lies, deception, demagoguery, and spin. When the whole world communicates to us things that are not true, how in the world are we and others supposed to believe anything different?